Okay, good evening. I'll introduce myself in one moment, but I'd first like to make an announcement about this space's accessibility. The community room is T-coil enabled. If you have T-coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-coil enabled device, but would like to use one of our headsets, we have made some available on top of the piano. I'll also request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of this program. My name is Cliff Robinson, and I'm the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. This evening's program falls within the annual series of public humanities events exploring the theme of democracy through this national election year. The series and tonight's program within it are made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's my honor to introduce our two guests tonight, both of whom are distinguished alumni of Rutgers University's Eagleton Institute of Politics. Elizabeth Matto, research professor at Rutgers University and the current director of the Eagleton Institute, is the author of Citizen Now, Engaging in Politics and Democracy, and she is the lead editor for Teaching Civic Engagement Across the Disciplines and Teaching Civic Engagement Globally. Her new book, To Keep the Republic, Thinking, Talking, and Acting Like a Democratic Citizen, examines the responsibilities that come with being a citizen in a participatory democracy, detailing how individuals may engage locally and nationally, and showing that it matters that they do engage. She makes a philosophical case for the practical exercise of democratic citizenship and its multiple facets, competing values, and immutable ideals. Peter Levine, author of What Should We Do? A Theory of Civic Life, calls it an idea-rich book that aims to inspire and guide action. And Elizabeth Beaumont, author of The Civic Constitution, observes that this book, coming from one of the most respected scholars and voices in the field, offers useful experience and wisdom in an unprecedented period in the history of American democracy. Elizabeth is joined in conversation tonight by John Farmer, university professor and director of the Miller Center on Policing and Community Resilience at Rutgers University. He is the author of The Ground Truth, the story behind America's defense on 9/11, which was named a New York Times notable book, and Way Too Fast, An American Reckoning, which was named a notable book by Shelf Unbound. From 2019 to 2023, he served as director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers. He is currently on leave to pursue a research year as the faculty fellow at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. So let's welcome everyone. Our two guests tonight. Thank you both for being here.
John's not on much of a leave.
Welcome everybody here to Eagleton West. Really delighted to be here tonight to celebrate the publication of Elizabeth's book, To Keep the Republic, and engage in some conversation about that book and her other work. Why don't we get started, Elizabeth, by just giving a sense of your background and
Okay.
what sparked your interest in political science and what caused you to go in the direction you have with youth participation?
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you, John, for taking time. I've been joking because you are supposed to be on leave and I haven't seen you do much resting during this period of time. So thank you so much for coming and thank you all for joining. I would say I'm fortunate in many ways in that the career I've been able to build really reflects my original interest in politics, which is I'm grateful for. Certainly, I grew up in a politically interested household. Grew up in Southern Nevada, grew up in Las Vegas, went to college, and yes, people do grow up in Las Vegas. And live to tell. Then went to school in Southern California. And we had always been a politically interested family, but it was in high school where I got my first taste of Washington, D.C. Did a week-long trip. They have these things called the close-up trip. So went to go do a week in DC. And that made an impression on me at the time. And then I was fortunate to win a Truman Scholarship when I was a junior in college, and which was transformational for many reasons. Transformational because there's really an emphasis with the Truman Scholarship on building a career in public service. So that sort of put that in my brain. But then really transformational because it allowed me to go spend a semester and a summer in Washington, D.C. as a junior in college. So I tell this story to students often that internships are really valuable, not just because they give you a sense of what you might want to do, but what you don't want to do. So I went to Washington, D.C. and did a semester working on the Hill, which I loved being on the Hill. I found it exciting, wonderful, but after my semester there, I thought, this is not what I want to do. Was fortunate, I did an internship at CNN that summer at a show called Crossfire, if people remember the show Crossfire. So was able to do, was an intern there when it was still—
That was the beginning of polarization.
I know, I was there. Pat Buchanan and Mike Kinsley were the hosts, if people watched it back then. Loved getting to do that, but also thought this is not what I'm interested in either. But what was helpful was it helped me understand. I liked the observation, the study, the analysis of politics. So after I finished undergraduate, I was fortunate to get into the doctoral program at George Washington University. The goal was to get back to DC and to keep studying. Was really fortunate. It was a moment where their American politics program in particular was really in its ascendancy, so got a great training in political science. But I think all the time knew I was interested in more than just producing scholarly research, was very interested in teaching, but even more importantly, wanted to make sure the research that I did had a purpose, had an application. At the time was very interested in voter turnout, and it seemed to me incomplete to just keep churning out research for my peers, wanted to be able to apply that research. So I was lucky, after I finished my doctorate, we were in New Jersey, I was fortunate to find the Eagleton Institute of Politics, frankly, at a time where Ruth Mandel, who some people may know in the building of Princeton, from Princeton, she was the director and really allowed me to shape a center, Center for Youth, the Center for Youth Political Participation.
Center did not exist before you, right?
Correct.
Center.
Correct.
What was your motivation by focusing on youth participation in particular?
I felt I wanted to, two things I would say, recognizing the real challenges that young adults face when it comes to accessing the political process, voting in particular, but I also wanted to be able to use I wanted to use experiential learning, the experience of participating in politics as a learning experience. So from the very beginning until today, we are always trying to weave, as you well know, our research and our teaching and our public service work, having one serve the other. So I think I was motivated by wanting to actually put my interest, my scholarly interest in voting into practice, working with students. I also, though, wanted to use it as a pedagogical experience for students, not just teaching this literature, but actually having students experiencing it by trying to register their fellow Rutgers students.
I know that you've done quite a bit of work with the American Political Science Association.
Yeah.
Have you noticed over the course of your career a greater interest in that practical aspect and putting a scholarship to work in a practical sense?
Thankfully, yes. I would say political scientists sometimes are the worst about recognizing how their scholarship should be applied to real-world political problems. I know when I finished at GW, finished my doctorate at GW, knowing I had this interest in applied politics, wasn't sure how you do that as a political scientist, because there was very, much to, throughout the American Political Science Association's history, there's been little attention, sadly, until about the last 20 to 30 years. I think there's been more scholarship, there's been more support for scholarship related to applied politics. There have been divisions, sections created. There is a conference related to it. There's a journal, because it is difficult for scholars, for especially people who are tenure track, to do this sort of experiential learning in their classrooms if there's not some way to attach some research to it. Is there a way that you can then present the work that you've done at a conference or publish it in a journal? So there has been, thankfully, more and more attention in the association. I've been fortunate, as was referenced in the introduction, there have been 3 edited volumes published by the American Political Science Association called about teaching civic engagement. Encouraging political scientists to include it in their work, but also offering best practices, evidence-based best practices for weaving teaching civic engagement into any discipline and even globally. Fairly recently, the president of APSA actually has a task force, created a task force about rethinking the political science major to encourage, to support political science departments who want to weave in civic engagement instruction, pedagogical exercises that would amplify what they're talking about in the classroom, And I was fortunate to be part of that task force. And we just issued the report the last few months. So we're kind of in the midst of a roadshow, trying to encourage political science departments to take this task force report and apply it as they see fit in their department.
Just to give you a sense of the disconnect that exists in academia between the scholarly side and the experiential side, I was pitching a program at Rutgers that it would involve students getting internships and finding careers in the intelligence business in DC and elsewhere, and met with this committee, and the eventually was, well, isn't that awfully vocational? You mean people are getting jobs? Yes. That's exactly what it is. But anyway, but it's good. It's good. I think those barriers are coming down. They did approve my program and Elizabeth's program.
Yeah.
So how has the research you've done to date informed your approach to writing this book?
So it's funny because in 2019, I was approached by Rutgers University Press they were reaching out to faculty across the university, asking them basically to put together almost primers on their subject matter. You know, what are the essential elements of the research that you do? And they approached me, I don't know, fall of 2019. And I thought, oh, this will be perfect. It's a really nice extension of the work I already do, either through the American Political Science Association or through my teaching. Certainly is in line with, John was the former director of the Eagleton Institute. I'm the current director, and the mission is linking the study of politics with the practice of politics. So I thought, oh, this will be a perfect extension of the work that I already do. And then clearly the world has fallen apart. No, the need for the book. It became more and more urgent. I mean, when you really think back to everything that has happened in the United States since 2019, really amplified the need for a book such as this. From not only January 6th, but having a president who was impeached twice, was quite visible about undermining and flouting democratic norms and ideals, from the global pandemic with millions dying around the world, to racial reckoning that has taken place after the killing of George Floyd, and then the aftermath of 2020 and the number of states that were questioning the legitimacy of the election. So for me, it certainly amplified the importance of a book such as this, and I was able to apply my scholarship and my teaching background to this text.
So let's turn to the book itself.
Okay.
And why don't we start with the title?
Okay. So it's based on. So the title is "To Keep the Republic," and it's based on a vignette that probably people have heard before. So the story goes that after the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the framers were leaving the Constitutional Convention, and apparently people yelled out to Benjamin Franklin, tell us what you've created. Is it a monarchy or a republic? To which he responded, a republic if you can keep it. So what's interesting, when you do a book, you do some research, and that's probably not true, or there's very little research to suggest that he actually said that. It may be more myth than reality, but it's a really useful myth. I think it's not only for, to have an umbrella for this book, but it suggests, I think, what I see as the core theme of this text, the idea that democracy is fragile, but also the idea that it's in our hands to keep it. So that's what really motivated, that was sort of the organizing principle. And I would say, the text really has three core goals in my mind. The first is to really broaden our conceptualization of what we mean by democratic citizenship. I've talked a lot about voting. Certainly so much of our attention when it comes to democratic participation is getting students to the polls and voting and thinking about these big elections every 4 years. But one goal was just to broaden that conceptualization of what it means to be a democratic citizen.
And in fact, the first part of the book, it's thinking, and then talking and acting, but in the thinking part, you kind of hold up as prophets of the kind of thinking that you're espousing. Walt Whitman and Alex de Tocqueville and also Learned Hand, the judge for the Second Circuit. Why did you pick, in particular, Walt Whitman struck me as, because he it seems to me that he thought democracy should be embodied.
Right.
So,
One of the, one piece of Walt Whitman's that I frequently use in my classes is at least snippets of its big democratic vistas. And just the title alone sort of is suggestive of aspirational definition or conceptualization of democracy. But that is really the core idea of that text, is the idea that apparently he wrote it to encourage us to create a democratic culture, a democratic literature, a democratic culture that resonated, that met the needs of democracy. So we weren't relying on someone like Shakespeare and writers' literature that was rooted in aristocracy. So really posits this idea that there is a literature within the ideals of American democracy, and that we should be thinking of democracy should be woven through everything. Democratic thought, ideals, tenets.
the way people talk to each other on the street, right?
The way you talk to people on the street, the way you interact with one another, it is beyond just the voting booth. It's our way of living. It's an ethos, almost a way of life. And I think Alexander in Tocqueville, there's that sentiment is sort of suggested that there's the idea of a democratic spirit. So I think thinking like a democratic citizen, much of that I resonated certainly after January 6th, in that so much of the imagery of January 6th, so much of the rhetoric of January 6th was this idea that you were saving the republic, that this was an assembly, a right to protest, and I even wrote an op-ed not long after January 6th suggesting it's a mischaracterization of not just that event, but how we should be thinking as Americans and American thought. So yeah, I think that's a really critical element of democratic citizenship.
So the culture of democracy is something that is embodied in the way people treat each other.
Yeah.
And you also go into some detail about the concerns of the founders about faction.
Right.
And you talk quite a bit about partisanship and the corrosive role that has played. Do you want to expand on that?
Right. I mean, certainly in that first chapter in particular about thinking like a democratic citizen, first of all, challenging us to recognize that there's more than one important democratic value. And often liberty is seen as sort of the preeminent, most important value in the hierarchy of all of these democratic values. But certainly, this ability, part of having a system of government based on liberty, as Federalist Paper number 10 is all about, is this idea that we are going to naturally disagree, that's baked into the system. And Madison in Federalist Paper 10 spends a lot of time saying we could all have the same values, we could all have the same belief systems, we could force people to have the same belief systems, but that's antithetical to the idea of a system based on liberty. And so there is an expectation, and again, these are expectations and aspirations, that that there will be a competition of ideals. And indeed, we have created a structure that is supposed to facilitate that competition of ideals, whether it's a federal system of government or separation of powers, checks and balances, so that it is it's been created that way, but also with the hopes that it encourages some sort of finding of common ground, or finding some sort of middle ground. Which clearly that's been a challenge.
I was going to say, have we sort of lost that cultural spirit that really is supposed to be embodied in everyday life? And if we have, how do we get it back?
So it's interesting you say that, because I certainly was having a similar conversation with students yesterday about to what extent to some extent it is a sort of a loss of an ethos, a loss of a common sensibility about what democracy is supposed to be. That also, there's only so much thinking about being a democratic citizen you can do. Sometimes it takes reforming the processes of democratic citizenship. So certainly something like gerrymandering, or where we have drawn district lines in such a way that it's almost encouraged ideological division, where you have
safe districts.
Yeah, you have all of these safe districts. So there's very little incentive for members of the House, for example, to try to come to some sort of compromise, because they only have one body of ideologues to satisfy. So that would be just one example of, are there reforms that we should do? Are there reforms that should be taken to address the structure? making it easier or maybe more likely for there to be compromise. But I also think it involves a lack of a willingness to compromise too.
And I guess one way to address it is the way we talk, right? That's the second part of your book, and that's informed, I know, by a course that you and Randy Shalevsky designed at Eagleton and have delivered at national conferences. So I want to talk about that, the evolution of that approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think much like I offer an encouragement to think of a broadened definition of democratic citizenship, I would say at the Eagleton Institute of Politics, at Rutgers in general, thinking broadly about how we teach democratic citizenship. We certainly pay a lot of attention, as I said, to things like voting and discussing electoral law, but really making a case for our ability to engage in difficult conversations, to talk across difference, is also a really important element of democracy. Certainly, Rutgers has not been immune to challenges when it comes to freedom of speech and controversial speakers and all of it. So really encouraged by both of those elements, we created a one-credit course for incoming freshmen called Talking Politics, Disagreeing Without Being Disagreeable, which really offers first a case for why it's important, why it fits in with democratic citizenship, amplifying this idea that it is, there are constitutional roots for us disagreeing, but then also helping students build a skill set and a confidence and a facility with having these conversations. So we spend some time in this class focusing on different skills involved with talking across difference. That might involve active listening, talking about why active listening is important, how to engage in active listening. We look at perspective taking, building a sense of empathy, and also fact-checking. Fact-checking not only others, but ourselves. Where are we getting our information? Before we are sharing information, do we know it's factually correct? So, like everything we do, we always try to share with students the scholarship behind it, but then offer them opportunities to practice it or to see it modeled. So in that class, we do a lot of talking about challenging topics. We bring in practitioners. We had one year where there was some sort of controversy on campus, and we were able to bring in the two students who are on campus and held opposing views, were leaders on both sides, but came into the classroom, demonstrated to students they were still friends, but they just fundamentally disagreed on an issue. We've brought in members of the New Jersey State Legislature from different parties. So letting students not only practice these skills, but see that it is possible. There aren't many models out there, but if we can bring the models into the classroom, even better. And yes, we were able to publish an article in the Journal of Political Science Education about the work that we had done. And we're in the midst right now, Eagleton, of hosting, really trying to take what we are learning and sharing it. Hosting a series of faculty workshops on the Rutgers campus, giving faculty some best practices and some tools for how to engage in this discussion in the classroom. I have found, and now, even now, especially now, students are paying attention, students want to have difficult conversations, but feel very uneasy and uncertain about how to do so. So if we can be teaching them, making it the subject of our courses, I think that's really beneficial.
So to what extent, so much of the talking now is over social media, and people tend to arrive at conversations with conclusions already drawn. How do you address that reality that so many decisions are formed outside of personal conversation, and instead they're on this artificial, and everyone's sort of driven into the cul-de-sacs of their own predilections, and so they become strangers to themselves. How do you address that challenge?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I think students know that they're not getting good information. They know how difficult it is to find good information. I think that's one of the first conversations we often have in the classroom is, how do I find a news source that I know is reputable? How do I find news that is unbiased? Where do I find it? How do I find it? And I think in many ways, students are savvier than we give them credit for, because especially Gen Z, millennials, have grown up with social media. Now, that doesn't mean we're not all vulnerable. We are all vulnerable to being siloed in social media, world. So I think being really really encouraging and sort of forcing students and each other to really think about their information. What are they taking in? How much are they taking in? How do you verify whether something is correct or not? Engaging in real media literacy. And there's much, much more we need to be doing at the college level. In K-12, there is more and more emphasis, I think, in including media literacy. New Jersey is one state that has mandated, and I'm not sure exactly how many, I feel like there might be 20 or so states throughout the nation that now have included media literacy as part of their social studies requirement. I think there's much more that we can be doing in higher ed to include media literacy in our civic engagement education.
One thing I find myself doing now is when I start talking to somebody, it's clear they're coming from a whole different information ecosystem.
Yeah.
Instead of talking about what we started, I'll start asking, where did you, is that a good place to start the Democratic?
I think so, absolutely. And I think even going a step before that is something we do in these classrooms is really prepare students to have difficult conversations. One thing we do, as you know, in not just that class, but others, is start every semester by creating almost a set of norms and practices, maybe ground rules for how we're going to... Civility pledges. It's not, I always tell students, it's not a contract, but a compact. But an agreement that we are doing together, saying we're going to have difficult conversations, but how are we going to go about it? How are we going to have conversations that are honest, that are candid, but that are productive, that are respectful? So something like that, I think we probably include as a norm that there is an expectation that people, you may have your views challenged, but you may even have the sources of your views challenged, and to be prepared for that. And I think it causes us to be self-reflective. Where did I get that information? I mean, I find myself saying it sometimes, saying, I saw, of course I haven't read the article, I saw the headline, but if I didn't actually open it and read the article. I know I'm guilty of it myself. We see the headline, and then we take it wherever we'd like to take it. So challenging ourselves.
I frequently don't click because I'm afraid I'll get 10 more articles like that. So I read the headline and say, fine, but I'm not clicking on it.
Right.
It's crazy.
And I think students, again, they have grown up with all of these platforms, and I think they're savvier than we give them credit for. But as I said, I think
the problem is us.
Yeah, it could be. But it doesn't mean they're not vulnerable. We're all vulnerable.
So after thinking and talking, the third pillar is acting.
Yeah.
I know you've spent a lot of your time at the Center for Youth Participating in Politics focused on the acting part.
Yeah.
So why don't you talk us through those efforts and what they've taught you about the acting out as a democratic citizen?
Right, and I would say, if sort of the first aim of the book is to have people sort of encourage us all to broaden our definition or conceptualization of democratic citizenship. The second would be really to offer us all sort of a scholarly context, a conceptual framework to be considering these different types of engagement. And around all of them, there's a really robust scholarship. So we have a better appreciation, for example, of voting. And again, this is informed a lot by my work with students. Often I'm finding myself dispelling the stereotype that young adults are disengaged, or they're lazy, or they're uninterested, and that explains their voter turnout rates. And I think it's real, what I like to usually come back at is we really have to consider the structures we have put in place surrounding something like voting, and how it benefits some and disadvantages others. And young adults are often disadvantaged by the way we do elections in the United States. As I referenced earlier, sometimes it's the structure that we've created that keep us from meeting these democratic ideals. So there's a lot of scholarship related to voting that demonstrates that there are tremendous burdens that fall harder on some than others. So just for example, the fact that every state has their own set of electoral practices and electoral law. In New Jersey, if you want to if you want to vote in an election, you need to be registered 21 days ahead of time. Where there are many states where you have same-day voter registration. There is a pretty significant effort in New Jersey that's being held up to get us to have same-day voter registration. But that makes a tremendous difference for 18 to 29-year-olds. It makes a tremendous difference for college students who, our students are moving onto campus the first week of September, and by middle of October, if they haven't registered or updated their voter registration, if they have a different address, they're not going to be able to vote in that election. So for people who move a good deal, and that's young adults, but that could also be lower income people who are transit moving frequently for jobs, if you're moving between states. So just the structure that is in place often can be detrimental and can help to explain, at least, why voter turnout rates are different among certain populations.
To address that, Elizabeth Center put together a 50-state map, which if you click on the state, it will tell you all of that information and how it differs from state to state. So it's a real good resource.
Well, and that came out in 2020. You know, for so many of us, we were concerned, for those of us who are interested in trying to support young adults voting. In 2020, one of the many concerns was, for Rutgers, we were all remote for a year. And for students who aren't on campus during an election, you're losing the support that you would get from organizations such as ours. So that prompted us, through a generous gift, we were able to put together quickly this map for Rutgers students who maybe in California, wanted to vote in different states. And that's another good example of the power of electoral law, because I don't know if folks know that in 2020, New Jersey actually had the highest youth voter turnout rates than any other state in the country. A lot of that had to do with the electoral practices we put into place. If you remember, we were in the midst of a public health emergency. There was concern about people going out to the polls. So in New Jersey, everyone who was registered was sent a ballot, whether you asked for it or not. And that made a tremendous difference for youth voter turnout, because just the barrier of having to request to vote by mail, wait for the ballot to come for you, fill it out, it's not clear, it's pretty confusing, mail it, put it back in the mail, that's a hindrance. So that was sort of one easy way in which you can enhance voter turnout.
There are other subtle ways that, maybe it's difficult for students. For example, in New Brunswick, they keep moving the polling places out of Rutgers. Farther away, so the students have trouble getting there.
Very few on campus.
And redistricting, both parties wanted to split Rutgers any number of different ways. The student vote was diluted a bit. So there are subtle ways that they put up barriers as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And and there's so much research that has demonstrated, the voter turnout rates in the United States, first of all, are always lower than comparable democracies. And much of that has to do with the way we do elections. The fact that, now, it's changing, but for the most part, for much of our history, the burden was on the individual to get themselves registered. There wasn't an automatic registration. That makes a huge difference. And we see there are always discrepancies in income level, education level, and certainly age.
And one of the points you make in terms of acting as a democratic citizen is too often it's seen as just voting.
Right.
And so your point is to embody that spirit, you have to be involved in other ways. So some examples of those.
Yeah, and again, right, wanting to be thinking sort of as in a fulsome way. The idea, there's one of the books that I was responsible for editing, a colleague, Nancy Thomas, wrote a chapter called Politics 365. But the idea that we're democratic citizens 365 days of the year, that it doesn't just end. Certainly in New Jersey, we have an election all the time. So you're always voting in New Jersey. But also there's all that time between elections, it's incumbent upon us to be paying attention. And so really identifying for students, for all of us, that there are ways in which we could be paying attention, but also trying to influence the actions of people holding office, whether it is by going to public meetings, making a statement at a public meeting. I think just letting students know that the agenda is supposed to be public, it's a public agenda, there's an opportunity for you to show up and to speak. Protests,
encampments,
that's acting like a democratic citizen. And running for office. I think helping students consider running for office. And a lot of our time, a lot of the work that we've done has been, as you know, and folks know here, the Center for American Women in Politics has been groundbreaking in training women to run for office. We've used that model with our Center for Youth Political Participation and have a program called Are You Running?, where we're trying to at least encourage Rutgers students to think about running for office, at least being involved in campaigns. and really demonstrating how, especially at the local level, there are so many opportunities to be politically engaged and play a leadership role. And it's always very gratifying when we see alums who are out there running for office or serving in office, and there are a lot of them.
Yeah, so the sort of tying everything together, the book ends with the story going back to Walt Whitman,
Yeah.
and also talking about his mixed legacy and his how he embodied democratic ideals, but also fell short in some ways, and his interrelationship with Langston Hughes.
Yeah.
So
That was something I learned. So yes, so as you referenced earlier, John, I looked to democratic vistas in particular, and a lot of the work of Walt Whitman is sort of setting this idea or this tone of thinking of democracy in a broad way, thinking of it as sort of being embodied in all sorts of practices, our everyday lives, everyday practices. So as I was working on the book, I thought it would be great. I've always wanted to go to Walt Whitman's house in Camden. So I'm not sure if people are aware of the only house that Walt Whitman ever owned is in Camden, New Jersey, on Mickle Street. Small little house about a block away from Rutgers Camden's campus. Had always wanted to go. They were closed for much of COVID. They were locked down for a long time. And I was able to have them let us in. So my husband and my son and I, we got to go. We got a private tour of Walt Whitman's house at Camden. And I really encourage everyone to go. There's so many original, it's a house where he died. It's a house, I guess he wrote several versions of Leaves of Grass, but apparently that was the last version he wrote there. A lot of Oscar Wilde visited him there. And so it was just a great experience in general. But there was a story I had no idea that I learned when we went to visit the house. It was an excellent piece written by one of the docents there in their newsletter. And as John had referenced it, I knew a bit, but I certainly learned much more. Walt Whitman was often described as the bard of democracy. So many of his works sort of evoke all of these images of American democracy: egalitarianism, equality, liberty. So it's disconcerting to know, there's also a really complicated legacy that Walt Whitman has related to race. Although he was writing during the Civil War, there was very little to no mention of, for example, the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We know that although he was opposed to the institution of slavery, he was not in favor of giving formerly enslaved African Americans the vote. And that's not something we know that we're only learning now. There was pushback. There was some prominent abolitionists who really were critical of Walt Whitman at the time. So a complicated history for sure. What I found this interesting story was learning that Walt Whitman died near the end of the 1800s, that it was actually Langston Hughes was invited to come and do a special event long after his death, 1925, 26, I believe. Langston Hughes was invited to come and speak at a special ceremony at Walt Whitman's home in Camden. And as we all know, Langston Hughes was a celebrated poet from the Harlem Renaissance. In many ways had a very similar writing style to Walt Whitman, very much trying to celebrate the everyday person, the everyday citizen. In many ways had a very similar style, and in many ways there was sort of a conversation taking place between the two of them with their poetry. So for example, Langston Hughes's poem, I Too, is a response to Walt Whitman's poem, I Hear America Singing. It was very purposefully a response to, we all, hopefully if you don't go up and look up the Let America Be America again, it's another really prominent Langston Hughes poem that really highlights the juxtapositions, but also the beauty and the aspirations of American democracy. So what I found so interesting was he was invited to come and speak at Walt Whitman's home. And in many ways, it was sort of celebrated as, a way to extend the message of Walt Whitman to African Americans at the time. There was a quote, and I'll pull it up. The Evening Courier, New Jersey's Evening Courier, actually described the event as, if old Walt Whitman atop Mount Olympus looked down upon his Mickle Street house Tuesday night, he might have felt that all his songs of equality had not been wasted upon a scurrying, restless world. So sort of seeing this coming back from Langston Hughes as, as that sort of rectifying his history. Langston Hughes got a lot of criticism, got some criticism about how could he go and why would he go and speak at Walt Whitman's home. And he fairly consistently was very defensive of Walt Whitman. Looking at Leaves of Grass, he writes that regarding Leaves of Grass, everyone should read and remember for its heart and essence are decency and democracy, friendship and love for every human being. And I found a lot of resonance to American democracy today. In particular, his idea that he expressed in an op-ed that Langston Hughes wrote entitled, "Like Whitman, great artists are not always great people." And he wrote, "Great people, so long as they are people, are not gods. They are mortal human beings subjected to all the currents and evils, sins and stupidities of their times. But they have left at their flaming best a great light for others, burning even brighter perhaps for the embers of his own personal failures." And to take it a step further, he not only was looking at Whitman, but even extended it to American democracy, which I wanted to read and share. He wrote, "If Whitman sometimes contradicted his own highest ideals, just as Thomas Jefferson did by owning slaves yet writing about liberty, it is the best of him that we choose to keep and cherish, not his worst." So in many ways, I thought that really speaks to this moment right now. It certainly speaks or resonates with conversations that I have with students, and that we will often talk about these democratic ideals, these lofty democratic ideals, and yet they will frequently remind me of how far away we are from these democratic ideals. And yet, we try to challenge them, and I think they are rising to the challenge, to really remake the structures in such a way that we at least get closer to these ideals. Recognizing the many imperfections of the vessels, whether it's Jefferson or Walt Whitman, but recreating structures where we can get closer to these ideals.
So when all is said and done, are we going to keep the Republic?
Fingers crossed. I would say, the things that concern me, but things that make me feel hopeful. I mean, one of my biggest concerns right now, I think, and probably others too, is that the concern that what we used to see as abnormal will become normal. Probably others are doing this too, but we're making all sorts of plans for Election Day. But we're also making all sorts of plans for after Election Day. That notion of a peaceful transition of power was always so assumed for years and years and years, generations and generations. We would have never dreamed that we'd have to be making the sort of preparations that we are thinking about now as to whatever the outcome is. Are we ready? Are we physically ready, prepared for the outcome of an election? That's unprecedented, and that's something that I would hate to become the norm. The threats that elected officials face, those are the things that are quite concerning. The things that always give me hope are students. And even yesterday, had a fabulous session with my students yesterday, and these are students who are passionate, are really concerned about the state of American democracy, but are still committed to American democracy. We were exploring in class this quote that I love from John Dewey, that is, democracy needs born anew with every generation, and education is the midwife. And we found ourselves really focusing on renewing or reborn, how to reborn American democracy, how the rebirth of American democracy. And I think in many ways students are equipped and dedicated to doing that. So that's always what gives me hope as our students.
And I think you're right. They're very savvy.
Yeah.
They do interrogate the sources of their information.
Absolutely.
And I think they've watched all this, and I think the students that I've had and you've had and others in the room, they're determined to fix it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great source of hope. Not sure how they're going to do it.
Yeah.
But I think that is a...
Absolutely. And I think when we see students who were our students who are actually out there doing that fixing, whether it's working to make polling locations more accessible, or there's a strong lowering the voting age movement, what's taken place in New Jersey regarding the county party line. I think students are seeing how the change of structures might make the voting process, might make democracy more accessible.
We're very proud that the
Yeah.
lawyers spearheading the challenge to the county ballot line were all Rutgers and Eagleton students.
Former
So,
students of John.
Yeah.
So they learned well.
That was a win. So I want to open it up now for questions.
Yeah, first let's thank John and Elizabeth.
Thank you.
And I'll ask for questions that you wait for me to bring you the mic. So I think I saw you first, and then I'll.
When it became clear that Richard Nixon had obstructed justice, the Republican leadership in Congress made it clear to him that resignation was his only option.
Yeah.
And fast forward 45 years, 47 years to January 6th, and you have the, analogous members of Congress physically under assault, and they shrug. When it came time for Nixon to resign, most of the country was okay with it. And in fact, there was a significant backlash against President Ford when he pardoned
Right.
Nixon. And today, if you can believe the polls, half the country is okay with the guy who, as you said, took a dump on 243 years of peaceful.
I don't think I said that, but I get your point.
But that becomes a horrific
Right.
thing that every American citizen who pays any attention should be outraged by.
Right.
So my question to you two folks is, what happened? Did half the country forget what it means to be a citizen? Did members of Congress forget what it means to swear an oath to protect the Constitution?
Yeah. John?
Well, it's interesting because after January 6th, there was a moment when it seemed the tide seemed to be running that way, the way it did 45 years ago. And in fact, we got a request from Congresswoman to basically dispel the rumor that this was somehow an Antifa thing. And so we did some social media research and were able to dispel that instantly. And so there was a moment when it looked like it was heading that way. Why did it suddenly turn? I think it turned because they were going like this with the polls.
Yeah.
And they knew that the money that was out there that President Trump had raised, something like $250 million. And I think that's what's, the money is what turned it around, I think. I don't know, but that's what it looked like to me. When you had Kevin McCarthy basically the day of January 6th saying this guy should never be president. Yeah. And then a week later, he's completely going the other way. Inexplicable other than in terms of just the dollars and cents of politics, I think. And they read the level of support that the president had in their own party and were afraid of it.
And then that also underscores the outside importance of people on the very left and the very right when it comes to parties and primaries. As we know, as referencing earlier, because so many districts are drawn in such a way, they're pretty ideologically similar. Because of the way we do elections too, we know that for primary, if voter turnout rates in a national election are maybe in the 60s, 70s, for primaries, they're 20s. The voter turnout rates for primaries are so low. And so it tends to be the people on the ideological extremes who show up for primaries. And so, that's where I think John's point is really relevant, that these people all want to get reelected.
And I think that there's a fracture within the Republican Party. And there's a large segment of that party now in Congress that really wants the federal government to fail. I mean, that's when you look at the last several speakers, nobody lasts. They can't because so much of their caucus, just wants to stop everything. Make the government shut down. I think they're sort of the inheritors of the Tea Party movement of 10 years ago. I think they have a real internal problem within that party that has yet to be resolved, and that is so many of them really want the government to fail. It's a remarkable thing to watch.
How does that explain the popular support he still gets in the polls?
I can't explain it. There was an event at Princeton today over at the former Wilson School or whatever, the SPIA, and there was a correspondent here from the New York Times who was showing all this polling data and the real split that's occurred in the country in terms of just wealth and education. Where it's leaving the Republican Party and it's going to the Democratic Party, and it's almost like the working class the working class white population is now overwhelmingly Republican. And that's a big change from a generation ago. And I think that's the source of the president's support. I think that's what he is a populist and his candor is too strong a word, maybe not. But he's appealing to that demographic that feels alienated from what's going on in the country. And I think that explains why he still gets so much support out there.
Dean Farmer and Elizabeth, that was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A number of European countries have been challenging the concept of elite democracy by putting things out for popular referenda and for study circles. In France, for example, on climate, in Iceland, and in Ireland on reproductive rights. What is your opinion of that? Could not that help to increase participation, even though it's not voting per se, development of ideas and discussion circles?
It's interesting you say that because I just did something similar in one of my classes. One of the classes I teach, our undergraduate associates class, gave them sort of 5 different scenarios. And one of them was about something citizens' assemblies, which may be something similar, I think, that you're referencing, Bill. And they have been fairly successful, not only at addressing public problems. So there are a lot of examples throughout the United States, I shouldn't say a lot, several examples throughout the United States, of these very local, hyper-local groups coming together that are referred to as citizens' assemblies to address a particular issue. A lot of them have been around climate. And I think, in that way, I think it's an interesting way just to encourage sort of a grassroots participation, more participation in a community. I think the challenge with almost any organized interest is there's always the free rider problem, and it's difficult to have access to these grassroots movements. Often it's people with more time on their hands or more resources that can be engaged in this work. But so I think it's a balance, I would say. I think the more opportunities we can create to encourage and even structure more citizen participation in the everyday working of American democracy is a good thing. But I also think we have to be still very cognizant. The challenges surrounding joining an organization or being an active citizen often fall along income lines and education lines. So I think that has to be considered when using these sort of participative formats. There's a great website called Participedia out of Harvard, a scholar named Archon Fung, who really, it's almost like a wiki, you can contribute to it, but to identify other examples around the globe of different creative ways to more directly involve citizens, whether it's participatory budget making. So there are some really interesting models out there. By the same token, I'm taking both sides. On the other hand, that's why we have a representative democracy also. I think we also don't want to do that to replace our representatives performing the function they should be performing. There are benefits to a Republican form of government. And if our representatives are not representing us well, we also need to make sure we're fixing that and not necessarily finding other ways for the public to take the responsibility. That's what I would say. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think, among the students, it's mystifying to them why the commissions that draw the districts are not independent. In most of the country, it's the partisan legislatures do it. In New Jersey, we have one independent member and then equal numbers of partisans. And when I tell them that an independent commission will never happen in New Jersey, and they're why? Well, because we don't have initiative and referendum in our Constitution. The states that have adopted independent commissions are all states that have that. And so when you put it up for a referendum, overwhelmingly people want the districts to be drawn by independent commissions. But in our state, it would have to go through the legislature first, and that's the last thing they want. And so, to your point, though, I mean, there's definitely a place for that kind of popular voice. It can be abused. If you look at California's Constitution, what a mess. I mean, they amend it by referendum every year and add crazy things to it. But I think if it's done right, in a state like New Jersey, it could have a really useful role in inspiring young people and others.
Oh, thank you very much.
And an addendum, I would say, is making it easier for people to run for office and be successful. Again, I referenced colleagues at the Center for American Women in Politics. I think some of that same literature applies to young adults. It's having the support, the institutional support to be a successful candidate, too, will make our representatives more representative.
My question.
Thank you very much. This is fantastic. I think a free press in journalism is so critical to having all of this function. I think it's like one leg of a three-legged stool, and without that, who knows what can happen, right?
Yeah.
And I think journalism was much more organic in past generations. And with the advent of technology, something really alarming, I believe, has evolved to such a degree, especially accelerated in the last 10 years or so, where you could look at a lot of ways, but many of these places are run by gazillionaires, billionaires, who are controlling things. And not only that, but in the last 5 years, there have been alarming situations which have been reported on of these large organizations conspiring with government agencies to manipulate information, which is, I don't even know the word for that. And even that news gets squashed. So how do you see a remedy for, rehabilitating journalism, or what's your view of all that? It just seems, like you had said before, it's hard to get information
Right.
and kind of sort through it. But there seems to be things happening in that arena that's not just, okay, let's figure it out. There's some real, very key things happening, and I don't think they're being talked about.
Right. I'll start with, I think one of the real challenges, and I'm seeing some exciting initiatives, is the erosion of local journalism and local news. And I think I talk to my students a lot about that. I mean, New Jersey in particular, it's hard to get local news. And I think in many, I think it's a given, but it's worth stating how detrimental that is to democracy. If we are all getting the same national story, and there's very little attention to not only the problems in your community, but how to fix them and who's responsible for fixing them or who's not fixing them. So I think one of the biggest on that issue is the erosion of local journalism. There are a couple really interesting initiatives. One that I really like is called the Ground Truth Project, but there's another called Reporters for America. But there is at least some sort of a groundswell for encouraging or supporting local news and local media. There's a lot that needs to be done along that way. And here back to, we've talked about the detriments of social media, which for certainly there are. But there are tools available that really offer access points for young journalists that they didn't have prior, students in particular. So that would be my quick take.
Yeah, I mean, the change is just so, when I was in the governor's office in Trenton, you couldn't get out of it, you couldn't leave your office without the press being there. I mean, they were everywhere. I mean, the Star-Ledger at one point had 15 reporters covering the State House.
Right.
It's a ghost town. I mean, Roger Saskin's here. He was the public information officer for public safety when I was serving as Attorney General. They drove us crazy, Roger, right? But they were there. I mean, and there's something about knowing that you're being watched that keeps the process honest.
But do you have an idea why it's not there?
I think it lost its value proposition. The newspapers started losing money. I think they were slow to adapt to the internet and to that development. And it's never really figured out what the value proposition is now. They were always trying to make money. They were always in it. But when they started losing astronomical amounts and kind of went into death spirals, and then started laying off reporters, and before especially at the local level, there's a lot of mischief going on because no one's watching.
Right.
And I do think though that an adjustment is starting to be made. I think you see more and more, like there's something called the Patch that comes out,
Right.
and they do a pretty good job. And there's an effort to do that. And there's some excellent local papers. But you're absolutely right. That's a huge change and really kind of corrodes civic trust, I think, because people have a sense that things are happening they're not aware of, but there's no one there to tell them. So.
Yeah.
Several years ago, right on several years ago on Heinz Plaza, as often happens, there was a rally. In this case, it was about gun control. There was a raft of gun initiatives that were going to go to the state legislature, or were in state legislature, or about to be voted on. And our local assembly person was here to speak, as well as many others. And at the end of the rally, he said, because of course, most of the people there were anti-gun, in favor of gun control.
Right.
I'm not hearing from you people. I'm not hearing from you, but I am hearing from the other side. So why are you not writing to me? And I, the next morning, sent letters, and to this day, that same assembly person thanks the writer profusely for getting back to him, for saying things to him. But I'm wondering if that's still a good form of engagement, and also whether, because a lot of people now contact their legislators online, are those contacts angry, just like everything else?
Right.
And do the legislators dismiss them because of it?
Right. I would say a few things. Certainly, the way I approach both the scholarship and the teaching is really emphasizing that there are all of these facets of civic engagement, whether it's thinking like a democratic citizen, voting, talking, all of them have to be, they all have to be used. All of these tools have to be used consistently, more than once, throughout our time on Earth. That's certainly something I'm often teaching students, that it's not enough. It's great that you are out protesting, or it is great that you are doing this one thing. If legislators don't see you voting and in large numbers and consistently, then it doesn't make nearly the impact that it would. So I think encouraging all of these uses, and often really reminding students that legislators want to get reelected, and they want to hear from you. They hear from you. But they also know if you're voting or not. And so I think thinking of all of these together, for someone we've sent a lot of students as interns, and students are, one of their jobs is often not just answering those phones, but really writing down who they've heard from and where they're from and what their complaint is. Similar to social media, it is really checked and monitored. So I'm not saying it's certainly cataloged, and that information is shared with public officials, and it's meaningful. But again, it's only meaningful if there are these other facets that are also engaged.
Yeah, I would agree. The best legislators have always been the ones that paid most attention to constituent relations, who are really, really on top of it. Bill Pasquarello is one, from northern New Jersey. You contact him, you get a response. And he thinks that's why he's gotten elected for 40 years or whatever, and I think he's right. But they don't all do it, but the best ones do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it just occurred to me that we use public funds for things that we care deeply about, like open space. We have a tax. Not advocating we should have more taxes necessarily, but we could use public funds to encourage and support local journalism. That is something I think the public would actually want to do, and then it would not have to rely on other sources. It would be public money, it would be neutral, and it might be more trustworthy. It just sort of popped into my head that we do use public funds for things that we all care about, and that maybe that might be a solution.
I wonder if there are any models, I don't know, if
I've
there are
never-
states that...
Well, there's the national.
Yeah, but at the local, right,
But a local
but a
level,
local,
like at a local level.
Yeah,
Right.
About 3 years ago,
Oh.
the state gave money to
To,
Montclair University. I think it was a grant program to journalism, but the trail died out. I haven't really heard anything.
Yeah, I don't know what happened with that money.
Yeah, there was $5 or $10 million dedicated by the state to foster local journalism.
We'll have to look at that. It's a good idea, Sue.
No one knows what happened. There's no coverage.
Yeah, there's no local journalism.
I believe they do have an institute there that's devoted to fostering community-based journalism. Not the name that escapes me at the
Okay.
moment, but I
At
do know
Montclair?
they created at Montclair some sort of center for
Okay.
that.
So look into that.
Thank you both so much. Elizabeth, I was hoping that you would talk a little bit more about the talking about across differences that you're doing.
Yeah.
And especially if we're going out and trying to have some of these difficult conversations, what are some like takeaways that we could apply?
That's great, thank you. It's funny, I think I shocked my students the other day. We were talking about the importance of professional development for teachers, and how important it is for K to 12 and for higher ed. And I said, speaking for myself, I never had in my doctoral program there was very little attention to teaching. It was, do you know how to do research? Do you know how to write? So I think that scared my students a bit, but. So I think faculty and also everyone, staff, everyday people are leery about going into political conversations. If we can, we avoid them whenever we can. I avoid certain family gatherings so you don't have to.
Family.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I'm not going to Thanksgiving. So I think, I mentioned a few skills that we teach, but I think one thing that I would say is something that we talk a lot about in our class, and I think it applies broadly, is we encourage our students at least, to go into a discussion as a discussion and not a debate, and don't assume and don't even try to change people's mind. I think dispelling students of that idea that that's the purpose of a political discussion is to change someone's mind, and to go into it instead maybe with a sense of inquiry, a sense of understanding of what is this person's views, why might they be coming at these views, and still recognizing their humanity and recognizing that we're all in this together. I think that's the advice I would give all of us. It's certainly the advice we give our students, is if we can approach it with a spirit of curiosity or inquiry rather than a desire to change people's minds. And I think the other thing I tell students, there's a lot of talk about civility and what do we mean by civility, and I tell students it's completely understandable if people are passionate and if these conversations get passionate. Politics is personal. If there's a way to still maintain that sense that this is we're humans, and to recognize each other's humanity in it, that's the best advice I could give. I don't know if it's always going to work, but that's the advice I would give.
Yeah, I've adopted a practice with, the family gatherings or whatever, where it goes down a certain road, I say, well, are you persuadable on this? And if the answer is no, then I say, well, how about those Mets? Because there's not, because once you get to a certain point, it can very easily devolve into name calling, and you don't want that.
Right,
So
right.
try to diffuse it.
Well, I don't want to prevail upon you any further at this point. Maybe we should end with the Mets. So let's thank our speakers once again.